You probably think you would never join a cult. That is exactly what she thought too. A college-educated woman with a master's degree in business. She was not desperate. She was not lonely. She was not stupid. She had a career, a family, and friends who loved her. 6 months later, she had drained her savings account, alienated everyone who questioned her decisions, and spent her weekends selling leggings at house parties while calling it a business. She was not in a cult. She was in an MLM. And here is the part that should disturb you. The exact psychological techniques that captured her mind, the same ones that built Jonestown, that filled megachurches with 10,000 tithing members, that turned ordinary people into political extremists, they are all the same techniques, different packaging. Identical playbook. The FTC knows this. Cult researchers know this. Psychologists have documented it for decades. And yet millions of people fall for it every single year. Because the playbook is invisible, until you know exactly what to look for. Today, I'm going to show you the shared manipulation toolkit used by MLMs, megachurches, and political movements. Once you see it, you will never unsee it. Welcome to the cult mind, where psychology, power, and persuasion collide, and nobody is as immune as they think. In 1961, psychiatrist Robert J. Lifton published a book that would change how we understand manipulation. After studying Chinese indoctrination programs, he identified 8 specific criteria for what he called thought reform. These were not opinions or theories. They were observable, repeatable psychological techniques that worked on anyone, regardless of intelligence or education. For decades, researchers applied Lifton's framework exclusively to traditional cults. Jonestown, Heaven's Gate, the Unification Church, Scientology. But starting in the 1990s, something changed. Cult researchers began noticing the same patterns appearing in places no one expected. In corporate seminar companies like Landmark Forum, in multi-level marketing organizations like Amway and Herbalife, in certain megachurches, and increasingly in political movements across the ideological spectrum. Stephen Hassan, a former member of the Unification Church who became one of the world's leading cult experts, developed what he calls the BITE model, which stands for behavior control, information control, thought control, and emotional control. In 2022, he explicitly classified MLMs as commercial cults, hitting all 4 categories of authoritarian control. Researcher Janja Lalich introduced the concept of bounded choice, a state where intelligent people make seemingly irrational decisions that feel perfectly logical within their controlled environment. Here is what these researchers discovered. The playbook never changes, only the product being sold. Over the next 12 minutes, I'm going to walk you through the 6 core techniques that MLMs, megachurches, and political movements all share, and I am going to show you exactly where each one appears in your daily life. The first technique is called love bombing. It is the universal entry point for psychological capture, and every single one of these organizations uses it. Psychologist Margaret Singer interviewed over 3,000 former cult members during her career. She defined love bombing as a coordinated effort that involves long-term members flooding recruits with flattery, verbal seduction, affectionate touching, and lots of attention to their every remark. In MLMs, this looks like the enthusiastic welcome at your first opportunity meeting. Everybody tells you how smart you are for seeing the potential. They talk about how you are exactly the kind of person who succeeds in this business. They add you to group chats where everyone celebrates every tiny win. You feel special. You feel seen. You feel like you finally found your people. In megachurches, love bombing happens through door greeters, small group welcomes, and pastoral attention that creates immediate emotional investment. Within weeks, you have more friends than you have made in years. The community wraps around you like a warm blanket. In political movements, it happens at rallies and in online communities. You show up, and suddenly you are a true patriot, a real American, someone who finally gets it. The shared grievance creates instant tribal bonding. You belong. Here is what makes love bombing so effective. It exploits one of the most fundamental human needs, the need to belong. And it is completely genuine in the moment. Those people really do feel excited to meet you. That is what makes it so hard to see as manipulation. But as cult recovery specialist Rick Allen Ross explains, if you leave, they are all going to say, "We are done with you, no more communication." The love was always conditional. The second technique is information control. Once the emotional hooks are set, all 3 domains systematically restrict access to outside information while flooding members with group-approved content. Lifton called this milieu control, the attempt to manage not just external communication, but eventually internal thought itself. The FTC released a staff report in 2024 analyzing 70 MLM income disclosure statements. What they found was systematic deception through 5 specific tactics, emphasizing high dollar amounts made by a tiny elite, leaving out the percentage earning nothing, presenting data in confusing ways, ignoring expenses, and omitting inactive participants who tried and failed. In 17 of the 70 MLMs studied, most participants made $0, Not a loss? Zero. Nothing. Yet companies continue recruiting through carefully controlled success narratives. In megachurches, information control operates through positioning the pastor as the sole interpreter of truth. Outside theological study is discouraged. Criticism of leadership is framed as spiritual attack. An investigation into Hillsong documented a church leadership rife with abuse, misconduct, and secrecy that persisted partly because congregants were conditioned to trust leadership over external criticism. Political movements create information bubbles through what academics call epistemic closure. When all mainstream sources are labeled fake news or corporate media, members have nowhere to turn for reality checks except approved sources. Research published in the Journal of Computational Social Science found that platforms like YouTube, responsible for 70% of what users watch, tend to push people into deep rabbit holes of content that leads to radicalization. The result is the same across all three domains. Your reality becomes whatever the group tells you it is. The third technique is isolation. This is perhaps the most damaging shared tactic: physical and social isolation from non-believers. Attorney Douglas Brooks, who represents MLM victims, explained the mechanism directly. You are trained to avoid people who question whether this is a viable business or not, which is exactly the same technique that cults use. They try to isolate you from people who question your belief system. MLMs specifically train members to view skeptical family and friends as dream stealers, people whose negativity threatens your success. This reframing transforms your support network into perceived obstacles. Your social circle gradually shifts until your upline and fellow distributors become your primary relationships. Megachurches achieve similar isolation by making church activities all-consuming. Sunday services, small groups, volunteer activities, Bible studies, social events, all within the church community. Former members consistently report that when they left, they lost their entire social world simultaneously. Political movements achieve isolation through media distrust and social pressure. Admitting doubt means risking rejection from your tribe. So you stay silent. And the silence reinforces the belief. The fourth technique is identity replacement. This is where the transformation becomes permanent, the gradual replacement of your pre-existing self with a new group-aligned identity. In MLMs, recruits transform into boss babes or entrepreneurs. A new identity complete with lifestyle branding, social media persona shifts, and public commitment to the business. The old self, with its skepticism and outside relationships, becomes something to escape from. The FTC documented cases where LuLaRoe pressured top earners to get weight loss surgery in Tijuana, Mexico, to better represent the LuLaRoe success story, literally reshaping bodies to match brand identity. Megachurch identity replacement centers on the born-again experience, where the old self is explicitly rejected as sinful or lost. The new identity carries obligations, tithing, service, testimony. These reinforce group membership and make leaving feel like losing yourself. Political identity replacement may be the most insidious because it frames itself as patriotism rather than transformation. Your political affiliation becomes not just a voting preference, but your primary identity. It organizes your entire worldview. Psychologist Bob Altemeyer's research on authoritarian followers found that high scorers become extremely submissive to authority figures who are dishonest, corrupt, and inept. They accept conclusions they like regardless of flawed reasoning. The identity captures the critical thinking. The fifth technique is sunk cost exploitation. Once identity transformation begins, organizations exploit sunk cost psychology to prevent exit. Each level of investment, financial, social, temporal, makes leaving more costly. The pattern is clearest in MLMs. The FTC documented how Advocare's compensation structure meant that 72.3% of distributors earned zero compensation. Another 18% earned between 1 cent and $250 annually. Yet participants were encouraged to buy more inventory, attend paid conferences costing $900 or more for success schools, and maintain monthly purchase quotas to stay active. The 2016 Herbalife settlement revealed that Nutrition Club owners spend an average of $8,500 to open a club. Almost 60% reported making no money or losing money, but the more they invested, the harder it became psychologically to admit the model itself was flawed. Megachurches escalate commitment through tithing pressure, service volunteering, and special building fund campaigns. Some churches require financial giving for membership in leadership or worship teams. The prosperity gospel framework makes this self-reinforcing. Insufficient giving becomes the explanation for insufficient blessing. The solution to doubt is always more investment. Political movements extract time, social capital, and public commitment. Attending rallies, posting online, arguing with family members, publicly identifying with the movement. These all become investments that make changing position feel like personal failure rather than growth. The sixth technique is us versus them binary thinking. All three domains install what Lifton called the demand for purity. A black and white worldview that divides humanity into absolute good and absolute evil. No neutral ground permitted. In MLMs, this manifests as believers versus haters, success-minded versus negative, dream chasers versus dream stealers. The binary reframes all criticism as jealousy or failure rather than valid concern. Megachurches deploy saved versus unsaved, spiritual versus secular, blessed versus cursed frameworks. Questioning leadership becomes questioning God himself. The phrase, "touch not God's anointed," is weaponized to silence criticism. Political movements achieve perhaps the most dangerous manifestation of binary thinking. Researcher Bob Altemeyer identified the authoritarian aggression component. People who score high on his scale act aggressively in the name of authority figures against designated outgroups. Critically, he noted similar patterns across ideological lines, in both right-wing movements and old hardline Marxist-Leninist groups. And here is where it gets disturbing. The documented harm from these shared tactics is not theoretical. It is quantified. A study of 31 former cult members found that nearly half had an anxiety disorder. 6 suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder. Dr. Marlene Winnell's concept of religious trauma syndrome identifies long-lasting impacts including despair from loss of faith, toxic guilt, and suicidal ideation. The FTC's enforcement record demonstrates the financial dimension. The Advocare settlement totaled $150 million. The company and its former CEO were permanently banned from multi-level marketing, the largest company ever to receive such a ban. The Herbalife settlement reached $200 million for 350,000 victims. Yet the FTC noted a cruel paradox. Victims of these schemes are the least likely of defrauded consumers to actually report it. Why? Because the self-blame programming is built into the manipulation toolkit. Across MLMs, megachurches, and political movements, members are taught that any failure reflects personal inadequacy rather than systemic design. MLM participants who lose money blame their insufficient effort. Former megachurch members report feeling they did not have enough faith. Political believers whose predictions fail intensify commitment rather than reconsidering. This self-blame prevents reporting, research, and recovery. It completes the manipulation cycle by ensuring victims protect the system that harmed them. Now look at your own life. Have you ever been told that people who question your choices just do not understand? That is isolation. Have you ever felt like you could not express doubt without being attacked or excluded? That is the US versus them binary. Have you ever stayed committed to something primarily because of how much you had already invested? That is sunk cost exploitation. Have you ever noticed your social circle shrinking to include only people who share your beliefs? That is information control reinforcing isolation. Have you ever felt that your identity was wrapped up in a group, a brand, a movement, a church, to the point where leaving would mean losing yourself? That is identity replacement. These are not cult tactics that happen to other people. They are human vulnerability exploitation patterns that exist on a spectrum. And every single one of us exists somewhere on that spectrum at any given moment. The difference between casual involvement and psychological capture is not intelligence. It is not education. It is not critical thinking ability. It is awareness. When you know what love bombing looks like, you can appreciate the warmth without being captured by it. When you recognize information control, you can seek outside perspectives before they are cut off. When you see isolation being engineered, you can fight to maintain your outside relationships. When you catch identity replacement in progress, you can hold on to your pre-existing sense of self. When you understand sunk costs, you can walk away from bad investments without feeling like a failure. When you notice binary thinking being installed, you can insist on nuance even when the group demands purity. The techniques are invisible until they are not. And once you see them, you can never unsee them. That is not a threat. That is a vaccination. Awareness does not make you immune. Nothing makes you immune. These techniques work because they exploit fundamental human needs that we all share. The need to belong, the desire for certainty, the quest for significance, the comfort of community. But awareness makes you resistant. It gives you a fighting chance to recognize the pattern before the pattern captures you. If this opened your eyes to something you had not considered, subscribe. The patterns are everywhere. I will show you where to look. The techniques are invisible until they are not.